It was 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of my front door closing. Quietly. Too quietly. At first, I thought it was a dream, one of those half-formed ideas your brain conjures up in the dead of night. But then, there it was again, the subtle creak of the floorboards in the hallway. My heart started racing, a strange mix of adrenaline and confusion. I glanced over at the other side of the bed. Empty. Lisa wasn't there. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes she got up in the middle of the night for water or to check on the kids. But something felt off. I sat up, my ears straining against the quiet. The next sound stopped me cold, the muffled hum of an engine outside. I rushed to the window and peeked through the blinds, just in time to see the glow of taillights disappearing down the street. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to think. Who leaves their house in the middle of the night without a word? Lisa had said nothing about going anywhere. My mind scrambled for logical explanations. Maybe she had some sort of emergency? Maybe she forgot to tell me about something important? But another thought wormed its way into my head, one I didn't want to entertain. Was she hiding something? The night passed in a haze of restless pacing and half-hearted attempts to convince myself it was nothing. When Lisa walked back in at 6 a.m., hair slightly disheveled and offering a vague excuse about needing some air, I knew this was something I couldn't brush off. It wasn't just the time she left. It wasn't the half-baked excuse. It was the look in her eyes, guilt trying its best to masquerade as nonchalance. That's when the cracks started to form, and I realized the perfect life I thought we had might just be a facade. By the time the following weekend rolled around, I had convinced myself to let it go. I wanted to trust her. After all, we had built nearly a decade of life together. But as Saturday evening crept in, Lisa told me she needed to run out for groceries at 8:30 p.m. Groceries. At night. On a weekend. I nodded, pretending not to find it strange, and watched her leave, my stomach knotting with unease. Her car's taillights faded into the darkness, and suddenly, I couldn't sit still. I grabbed my keys and followed a few minutes later, not knowing what I'd do or find but feeling that I needed to know. I stayed far enough back to avoid suspicion as her car navigated through our quiet suburban streets. I expected her to head to the grocery store 2 miles from our home. Instead, she turned into a dimly lit parking lot behind an old strip mall. I parked across the street, cutting the engine and sitting in silence, watching. Lisa's car idled for a moment before another vehicle pulled up beside hers. A man stepped out tall, confident, wearing a leather jacket. He leaned into her window and spoke for a moment before climbing into her passenger seat. I froze, my chest tightening as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. Was she meeting a friend? A coworker? But why here, in the middle of the night, in this shadowy parking lot? They sat there for what felt like an eternity before Lisa's car slowly pulled out and drove off. I started my engine, trying to keep a safe distance as I tailed them. Their destination was the last place I expected, a motel on the edge of town. I pulled into a gas station across the street and parked behind the building where I could see without being seen. Lisa's car stopped in front of one of the rooms. The man got out first, glancing around casually, before Lisa followed. He unlocked the door, and they disappeared inside. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My stomach churned with anger, humiliation, and disbelief. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't innocent. I sat there for 20 minutes, hoping against hope that they'd come back out, that there'd be some kind of explanation, but nothing. The lights in the room flicked on and stayed that way. I felt like I was suffocating. I needed proof, though. Something definitive. Something she couldn't deny when I confronted her. I wasn't about to storm the room like a madman. I wanted her to explain herself, to admit it. I drove home, my mind racing the entire way. I spent the rest of the night in our living room, pacing, replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few weeks. The times she'd been busy, the unexplained absences, the sudden distance between us. It all added up now. But the most painful part? The question of why. What had I done wrong? Had I been inattentive? Distant? Did she think I didn't love her anymore? I hated myself for even asking those questions, for trying to shift blame onto myself for her actions. Lisa came home at 2 a.m. I heard the front door click open, her keys jingling softly as she tried to be quiet. My back was to her as I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. "Hey," she said softly, surprised to see me awake. "Hey," I replied without turning around. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, walking toward the kitchen. "Something like that." She didn't ask any more questions. She poured herself a glass of water and disappeared upstairs. The casualness of it all burned me up inside. She came home from a motel in the middle of the night and acted like it was nothing. I couldn't sleep after that. I couldn't look at her the same way. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I spent the day gathering evidence. I called the motel and, with a little charm and persistence, convinced the receptionist to confirm that a room had been rented the night before under the name of the man I had seen. I checked Lisa's calendar on her phone, something I'd never done before, and found more meetings and errands that lined up suspiciously with late nights and weekend outings. The final piece came later that evening when Lisa was out of the house. I found a credit card statement in her purse with a charge for the same motel on a night she'd claimed to be working late. I sat at the dining table with the statement in front of me, staring at it, trying to decide how I'd bring it up. Part of me wanted to rip into her, to demand answers right then and there. But I knew I needed to keep my cool. If I let my anger take over, she'd shut down, and I'd never get the truth. By the time she came home, I had a plan. I greeted her like normal, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was already preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I waited 2 days before I confronted her. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see if she'd crack on her own. Each moment of watching her go about her day as if nothing was wrong felt like a personal insult. She kissed me goodnight, laughed with the kids, and even asked me what I wanted for dinner one night. I almost blurted it out then, sitting across the dinner table, looking at her as she cheerfully dished out pasta for Emma and Jake. The thought of this same woman, so normal and composed, sneaking off to a motel with another man just days earlier made my blood boil. But I held it in. When Friday came, I decided it was time. The kids were spending the night at my sister's house, and we had the place to ourselves. Lisa was in the kitchen when I walked in. She looked up and smiled. "Hey, you want a drink?" she asked, holding up a bottle of wine. "No," I said flatly. "We need to talk." The smile faded from her face instantly. "What's wrong?" I motioned for her to sit down at the table. She hesitated, then did as I asked. "Where were you on Tuesday night?" I asked, leaning forward and resting my hands on the table. She frowned, confused. "Tuesday? I told you I went to grab groceries." "Why?" "Don't lie to me, Lisa," I said, my voice sharp and unwavering. "I followed you." Her eyes widened slightly, the color draining from her face. "What are you talking about?" "You didn't go to a grocery store," I said. "You met some guy in a parking lot, drove to a motel, and stayed there for hours. So, I'll ask you again, where were you on Tuesday night?" Her lips parted as if she was about to say something, but no sound came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, completely unprepared for the situation she found herself in. I don't know what you think you saw, but..." "Stop," I interrupted, slamming my hand on the table. "Don't insult me by pretending I'm stupid. I saw you. I called the motel. I checked your credit card statement. I have all the proof I need." The room fell silent. For a moment, I thought she was going to deny it again, but then she let out a long sigh and looked down at her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "That's all you've got to say? Who is he?" "It's not what you think," she said, finally looking up at me. "Then explain it to me," I said. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around behind my back with some guy." She hesitated again, as if trying to decide how much to tell me. "His name is Aaron," she said finally. He's someone I met through work. Someone you met through work, I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. And what exactly were you doing with him at a motel? Her face flushed, and she looked away. We were just talking. Talking? I said, standing up abruptly. You expect me to believe that? You don't sneak off to a motel in the middle of the night to just talk. I swear, it's not what you think, she said, her voice rising. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. Stop, I said, cutting her off again. I don't want excuses. I want the truth. How long has this been going on? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head. It's not like that. How long? I repeated, my tone ice cold. She hesitated, then finally said, a few months. A few months. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. All that time, she had been lying to me, pretending everything was fine while sneaking around with someone else. Why? I asked, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. What did I do to deserve this? You didn't do anything, she said quickly. This isn't about you. Then what is it about? I demanded. Because I don't understand. We had a good life, Lisa. A good marriage. And you threw it away for what? Some fling with a guy from work? It wasn't like that, she said, shaking her head. I wasn't looking for anything. It just happened. It just happened, I repeated, laughing bitterly again. Do you even hear yourself right now? You don't accidentally cheat on your husband. You make a choice. So why, Lisa? Why did you choose this? I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. I was unhappy. I felt stuck. And he made me feel wanted. Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. I wanted to yell, to scream at her, but all I could do was stand there, staring at her as she cried. Do you love him? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head quickly. No. It wasn't like that. I never loved him. Then why? I asked again, my voice trembling. Why wasn't I enough? She didn't have an answer for that. She just sat there, crying into her hands, while I stood over her, feeling more broken and betrayed than I ever had in my life. I hope it was worth it, I said finally. Because you've destroyed everything we built together. Her head shot up, and she looked at me, panicked. Please, Tom. Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. It's too late, I said, cutting her off. You made your choice, Lisa. Now you have to live with it. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing at the kitchen table. For the first time since we got married, I didn't feel like her husband anymore. I felt like a stranger looking at the wreckage of a life that had been torn apart by her betrayal. After that confrontation, I couldn't just sit and wallow in my misery. Anger started bubbling beneath the surface, refusing to let me rest. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was calculated. Sneaking around for months, lying to my face, and smiling like nothing had happened. Lisa had underestimated me, assuming I would roll over and beg for an explanation. She was wrong. The first step was information. If she was going to play dirty, I could do the same, but smarter. I needed details, proof to back up what I already knew. My first move was to hire a private investigator. It felt dramatic at first, something out of a bad TV show, but I wasn't playing games anymore. I needed leverage. The investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Erin, was efficient. Within a week, she handed me a folder thick with photos, texts, and receipts. Pictures of Lisa and Erin together at restaurants, in his car, and entering the motel on multiple occasions. Text messages full of flirtation and plans to meet. Even a few receipts for gifts he had bought her, a bracelet, a bottle of perfume, and once, a hotel room in a neighboring town. The evidence hit me hard, but it also gave me purpose. I wasn't going to confront her again with this. Words were useless now. Instead, I focused on my next move, dismantling the perfect little world she thought she still controlled. Lisa and I had joint accounts, but I'd always been the one managing the finances. It didn't take long for me to quietly separate my money from hers. I opened a new account under my name and transferred the bulk of my savings there, leaving just enough in the joint account to cover household expenses for a few weeks. Next, I secured the house. My name was the only one on the deed, as I'd bought it before we got married. It was a detail Lisa probably hadn't given much thought to, but it worked to my advantage. I spoke to a lawyer about my rights and confirmed that I could legally evict her if necessary. Then, I turned my attention to her reputation. Lisa worked as a graphic designer for a mid-sized firm, but Aaron? He was her supervisor. That gave me a perfect opening. I compiled a carefully curated packet of evidence, just enough to expose their inappropriate relationship without incriminating myself for snooping. I didn't deliver it directly to her boss. Instead, I mailed it anonymously to the company's HR department, complete with a letter explaining how their behavior violated company policy. I knew it would take a few days for the fallout to begin, so I prepared for the next step, confronting Aaron. One evening, I waited outside his office building, sitting in my car and watching as employees filtered out. When Aaron finally appeared, I stepped out of my car and blocked his path. "Tom, right?" he said, looking uncomfortable. "Let's talk," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. He glanced around nervously. "Look, I don't think." "You've got two choices," I interrupted. "We can do this here, or we can go somewhere more private. Either way, we're having this conversation." Reluctantly, he nodded, and we walked to a nearby coffee shop. Once we were seated, I didn't waste any time. "I know everything," I said. "You've been sleeping with my wife." His face turned pale, and he opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. "Don't bother denying it. I have proof, texts, photos, the works. Now, you might not care about your reputation, but I'm guessing your company would. And I'm guessing your wife, if you have one, might be interested to hear about this too." He sat there in stunned silence, clearly struggling to figure out what to say. "I don't want anything from you," I continued. "But you're going to stay away from Lisa. No more calls, no more texts, nothing. If I find out you've contacted her again, I won't stop with HR. I'll make sure everyone in your life knows what you've been up to." Aaron swallowed hard and nodded. "Fine," he said. "It's over. I'll cut ties." "Good," I said, standing up. "And just so we're clear, you don't come near me or my family again." He nodded again, and I walked out, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The fallout came faster than I expected. Lisa's company put her on unpaid leave while they investigated the claims against her and Aaron. When she confronted me about it, I played dumb, feigning surprise and concern. "That's awful," I said. "Do you have any idea who would have reported it?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. Maybe someone at work found out?" "Maybe," I said, hiding my satisfaction behind a mask of sympathy. Meanwhile, I moved ahead with my plan to separate our lives completely. I told Lisa I wanted a divorce. She begged for another chance, promising to end things with Aaron and work on our marriage, but I was past the point of caring. "This isn't just about the affair," I told her. "It's about trust. You broke it, and I can't get it back." I filed the papers the next day. The final blow came 2 weeks later, when Lisa was served with an eviction notice. She had nowhere to go, no savings, and a reputation in tatters. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. "Where am I supposed to live?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That's not my problem," I said coldly. "You should have thought about that before you decided to destroy our marriage." As she packed her bags and left the house for the last time, I felt a strange sense of relief. The life we had built together was gone, but so was the weight of her betrayal. I had taken control of the situation, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Lisa's departure didn't bring the sense of closure I had hoped for. The house felt emptier than ever, not just because she was gone, but because I was left with the wreckage of a life I thought I knew. There were no more lies, no more excuses, no more waiting for the truth. The truth was out, bare and raw, but it wasn't enough. I spent the next week avoiding her calls. She tried reaching out multiple times, leaving voicemails that alternated between tearful pleas and angry accusations. I didn't respond to any of them. I needed space, and more than that, I needed time to figure out what came next. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I finally decided to answer when her name popped up on my phone. "What do you want, Lisa?" I said, my voice cold and direct. She hesitated on the other end, her breathing uneven. I need to talk to you, Tom. Please. We've said everything that needs to be said, I replied. No, we haven't, she said quickly. Not like this. Not face to face. Can you please meet me? Just once. That's all I'm asking. I didn't want to agree. Every fiber of my being wanted to slam the door on her and never look back, but something in her voice stopped me. It wasn't guilt or pity, those feelings had burned out weeks ago. It was the need for finality. Fine, I said. Tomorrow night. 7 o'clock. My house. Don't be late. The next day crawled by, every hour dragging longer than the last. When the clock finally struck 7, Lisa arrived on time, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Come in, I said, stepping aside to let her in. She walked into the living room and sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I stayed standing, leaning against the wall with my arms crossed. So? I said. What is it you need to say? She looked up at me, her eyes glassy with tears. I'm sorry, she said softly. For everything. For the lies, the betrayal, all of it. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed you to hear that from me. I didn't respond. I just stared at her, waiting for her to continue. I know I hurt you, she said, her voice shaking. And I know I can't fix what I've done, but I want you to know that it wasn't about you. It wasn't because of anything you did or didn't do. Then what was it about? I asked sharply. Because I've been racking my brain trying to figure out what the hell went wrong. You had everything, Lisa. A husband who loved you, kids who adored you, a life most people would kill for. So why throw it all away? She wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling. I don't know, she admitted. I was selfish. I was stupid. I took everything for granted, and I let myself believe that I could have more, that I deserved more. More than what? I demanded. More than a stable family? More than a husband who trusted you? What more could you possibly want? She shook her head, unable to answer. I don't know, Tom. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I don't. All I know is that I ruined everything, and I hate myself for it. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and hollow. I wanted to believe her, to take her at her word, but the damage was too deep. So, what now? I asked. What do you expect me to do with all of this? I don't expect anything, she said quietly. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. That I'll spend the rest of my life regretting what I've done. I let out a bitter laugh. Regret doesn't change anything, Lisa. It doesn't undo the lies or erase the pain. It doesn't bring back the trust you destroyed. I know, she said, her voice barely audible. I needed you to hear it. I needed you to know that I never stopped loving you, even when I didn't deserve to. I shook my head, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Love? Don't talk to me about love. Love is loyalty. It's honesty. It's putting someone else's needs above your own. What you did wasn't love, Lisa. It was selfishness. Plain and simple. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Look, I said, my voice softening slightly. I don't hate you. I don't have the energy for that anymore. But I can't forgive you either. Not now. Maybe not ever. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. What about us? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Is there any chance, any hope at all? I shook my head. No, Lisa. There's no going back. Too much has happened. Too much has been broken. She nodded slowly, as if she had expected my answer but still hoped for something different. What about the kids? She asked. How do we handle this with them? We tell them the truth, I said firmly. That we're separating. That we both love them and will do everything we can to make this as easy on them as possible. But we don't drag them into the details. They don't need to know why. Not yet. She nodded again, wiping at her face. Okay, she said. I'll follow your lead. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything unsaid filling the room. Finally, I stood up and walked to the door. It's time for you to go, I said. She stood, hesitating for a moment before walking past me to the door. As she stepped outside, she turned back to look at me one last time. Thank you, she said softly. For hearing me out. I didn't respond. I just closed the door behind her and locked it. For the first time in weeks, the house felt like mine again. Quiet, empty, and strangely peaceful. I sat down on the couch and stared at the wall, the weight of everything finally starting to lift. It wasn't closure, not completely, but it was a step forward. And for now, that was enough. The days following Lisa's departure were an odd mix of relief and uncertainty. My routine adjusted quickly, almost automatically, as if my mind was too exhausted to overthink anymore. Mornings became quieter, but not unpleasantly so. The kids, though confused by the sudden changes, took my explanation with a maturity I hadn't expected. I kept it simple. Mom and Dad had decided it was best to live apart. I reassured them we both loved them and would always be there for them. Emma, ever the practical one, asked if this meant she'd have to pack a bag to visit Mom. Jake was quieter, thoughtful, but his eyes betrayed a sadness I hadn't seen before. I made a mental note to keep an eye on him, to make sure he knew he could talk to me about anything. Lisa moved into a small rental about 15 minutes away. We divided custody as evenly as possible. The kids spent half the week with her and half with me. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. In those first few weeks, I avoided unnecessary contact with her. Every interaction felt like opening a barely healed wound, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I focused on the house, the kids, and myself. I went through our shared belongings, deciding what to keep and what to let go of. Some items were easy to part with, furniture she had picked out that I never liked, old trinkets that held no sentimental value. Other things were harder. A photo album from our early years sat untouched on the shelf for days before I finally worked up the courage to open it. Looking at those pictures, I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and detachment. There we were, smiling on our wedding day, holding newborn Emma in the hospital, building sandcastles on a beach in Maine. At the time, those moments felt like the foundation of something unshakable. Now, they felt like remnants of a house that had been torn down, scattered bricks and broken beams. I closed the album and set it aside, deciding to keep it for the kids. It wasn't their fault things had turned out this way. They deserved to hold on to the good memories, even if I couldn't. Work became a welcome distraction. My job, which had always felt routine, now gave me a sense of purpose. I threw myself into projects, taking on extra tasks whenever I could. It wasn't just about staying busy, it was about proving to myself that I could move forward. But nights were the hardest. Once the kids were asleep, and the house fell silent, the weight of everything would settle on my shoulders. I replayed conversations in my head, dissecting every word, wondering what I could have done differently. I thought about Lisa, about the life we had built and the choices she had made to tear it apart. For weeks, I wrestled with anger, sadness, and a lingering sense of failure. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, those feelings began to shift. The anger dulled, replaced by a kind of weary acceptance. The sadness didn't disappear, but it became easier to carry. And the sense of failure? That took the longest to let go of, but I eventually realized it wasn't mine to bear. Lisa's choices were her own. They weren't a reflection of me or my worth. That realization didn't come in a single epiphany but rather in small moments, talking to Emma about her school project, helping Jake practice for his soccer tryouts, laughing with an old friend over drinks. One evening, a few months after the separation, Lisa called. It wasn't her usual quick check-in about the kids or scheduling logistics. Her voice was softer, more tentative. "Tom, I just wanted to say, thank you," she said. "For what?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "For how you've handled all of this," she said. "For not turning the kids against me, for being civil even when you didn't have to be. I don't deserve it, but I appreciate it." Her words caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "I'm doing what's best for the kids," I said finally. "That's all that matters." "I know," she said. "And I'm grateful. I really am." There was a long pause before she added, "I'm working on myself, you know? Trying to figure out why I did what I did. It's not an excuse, but I just wanted you to know." I didn't reply. What was there to say? I wasn't interested in her self-reflection or her reasons. But I appreciated the effort, even if it came too late. "Take care of yourself, Lisa," I said, ending the call. After that, something shifted in me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step closer to letting go. Life didn't magically become easier, but it became manageable. I found joy in small things: a weekend hike with the kids, a spontaneous road trip to visit my parents, a quiet evening reading a book. One day, while cleaning out the garage, I stumbled across an old box labeled Tom's Stuff. Inside were a few forgotten mementos from my pre-marriage days, concert tickets, postcards from friends, a dusty journal I hadn't opened in years. Flipping through the pages, I found entries from a younger version of myself, full of hopes and plans for the future. I smiled, realizing that while some of those dreams had changed, others were still within reach. Lisa's betrayal had taken a lot from me, but it hadn't taken everything. I still had my kids, my health, my career, and most importantly, myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in months: hope. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was still mine. And I was ready to start living it on my own terms.